This is the first video for Chapter 33. Chapter 33 is titled Fiscal Policy, Deficits, and Debt. So we'll start off talking about what fiscal policy is. So fiscal policy the word fiscal means financial as it relates to government in some way, either as it relates to taxes, revenues, or debt. So the government has a fiscal year, and that's related to the federal government budget. I believe it's September 1st to August 31st, but don't quote me on that. Some businesses have a fiscal year that actually runs from January 1st to December 31st, and that's how they pay their annual taxes. As of December 31st, they need to get their accountants in there and add things up and file their tax return for that year. Other businesses can legally have a fiscal year from something like July 1st to June 30th. And by June 30th, that's when they bring in their accountants and they add up their year over the past 12 months and pay their taxes. So the word fiscal has to do with finances in terms of paying taxes, government budget, government debt. All right. Fiscal policy then is defined as the taxing and spending policies of the federal government. You need to memorize that. Write that down. Fiscal policy is the taxing and spending policies of the federal government. That's what you say if you're asked on the AP exam or anywhere. So we're going to talk about government policy here. Specifically, fiscal policy is the prerogative of Congress and the president. So Congress puts together a budget and presents it to the president, and that budget is the fiscal policy of the federal government for that year. It's the budget says how many revenues they're going to have, what the tax structure is going to be, and what spending they're going to do during the year. And hopefully that's going to be a balanced budget. Often it isn't. We often have what we call deficit budgets. Over the past number of years, we've had pretty large deficit budgets. We go into deeper and deeper into debt. We talked about that in class one day, a couple of weeks ago. So the first thing we're going to talk about with fiscal policy is fiscal policy during a recession. And this is the perfect time to be talking about it. We're headed into a recession right now as a result of the coronavirus, businesses closing, consumer spending way, way down. All right, so let's get a graph going here. Price level, GDP, the output of the country. And let's imagine that a nation started off in long-run equilibrium. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, right at the point where we're at full employment output. So remember, we had the concept of long-run equilibrium in microeconomics. In macroeconomics, this is what long-run equilibrium looks like. All three of those lines coming together at that price level. We'll call it price level 1. What's happening in our economy right now is aggregate demand is falling way off. Call that aggregate demand 1 and this aggregate demand 2. So aggregate demand is shifting way to the left because people have to stay home. They're not going out and buying things, no movies, no entertainment, no restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. In 2007-8 crisis, especially in 2008, it was businessmen who stopped spending because the real estate bubble burst. Mortgages were going bad. Mortgage instruments that people had invested in were not paying off. And so credit dried up, and it was investment spending that caused the big shift to the left of the AD curve. This time, it's going to be consumer spending that is going to fall off and cause that shift. And of course, businesses having shut down, that's going to add to it. So investment spending is shutting down also. As a result of the coronavirus. So it's both consumer and business spending at this time. So we are going to slide, because you know about the sticky price problem, we're going to slide along this portion. The AS curve really doesn't go down here. It's going to be a long time before we see prices starting to drop to get us down here. We're going to slide along this point, and we're going to get the full multiplier effect, and output is going to be way down here. We'll call this Y2 associated with AD2. So we're in recession. How do we get out of this? So one thing is that the government can step in. And we're going to talk about whether the government should step in or not later on. But for now, let's say that the government steps in to do something in regard to fiscal policy action. And as we know, as I'm talking right now, the Senate is debating its stimulus package. Last I heard, they were going to vote on some $1.8 trillion of stimulus for the economy to try to shift that aggregate demand curve back to the right a little bit. So that's spending. So one thing that government can do in this recessionary period is increase government spending. But before I write that on the board, I'm going to write one more thing on the board here. A recession calls for what we call expansionary fiscal policy. And expansionary fiscal policy means either government does one of two things. One, government increases government spending. Remember that G was government spending. Remember this equation up here. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X sub N. So we can increase government spending. The other thing that government can do to stimulate the economy is to reduce taxes. TX is going to be my symbol for taxes, taxation. And a third thing the government could do is a combination of the two of them, okay? 3, they can do both together, increase spending and decrease taxes, okay? Do them both together. That would be expansionary fiscal policy. The idea that government would be spending and it would push the AD back to the right. The multiplier effect will go into action here. Government doesn't need to spend the entire amount. So I'll tell you right now, to me, if the Congress is thinking that they're going to increase spending by 1.8 trillion, we must be thinking that this recession is going to cost us some 4 trillion in reduced GDP. You know, out of a $22 trillion annual GDP, that would shift us back to about an $18 trillion GDP for this coming year if we didn't do anything. Government, apparently the Congress has been told that if they do about 1.8 trillion in fiscal policy spending, that the multiplier should double that and we can get ourselves back to where we should be at AD1 here. So that's video number 1 on expansionary fiscal policy. The next video will be on contractionary fiscal policy.